Okay, so good morning, everyone. Good to have you back. Nice to start another season. I've lost track of what number this is, but whatever it is, Baruch Hashem, it's good to be back with you. We have a few mazel tovs. We want to wish a mazel tov. I think, Debbie, you get a mazel tov on a new baby. Michelle, you get a mazel tov on a new baby and an engagement. Chedva, you get a mazel tov on, what did we have? We had a bar mitzvah. Any other mazel tovs? Okay, Baruch Hashem. We should always be able to share simchas. Okay, let's look at our parsha. Oh yes, I did see that. Oh. My glasses. Yes, Baruch Hashem. Thank you. Okay. Get mazel tovs for who moved to Israel? Made Aliyah? Moved to Israel when? How come we don't know this information? Okay. Wow, mazel tov, I guess. Okay, Rosie, you get a mazel tov for something?
My children moved on August 6th. Aryeh Friedman.
to Israel. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we should all have class in Israel. That would be amazing. We could go and we could have class in Israel. Okay, so mazel tov. That's a lot of trepidation there, I'm sure. Okay, let's get going. We are talking about the journeys of Bnei Yisrael through the Midbar. Okay, page 918. 918, the pasuk says, oh yes, thank you, Sue. Second time you did that. We want to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of Sue's mother, whose yahrzeit is tonight, Le'ilui Nishmas Shifra Rezel Bas Tzvi V'Sara. Her neshama should have an aliyah through the Torah that we learn in her memory this morning. Thank you. Okay. So we said that Bnei Yisrael, if you remember, these are the journeys. We're in Parshas Maseh, page 918, as we are the last Parsha of Chumash Bamidbar, almost finishing Chumash Bamidbar. So the Torah tells us that Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim, Pasuk Gimel that we learned last year, Vayisu'u me Ramses. They left Ramses, B'chodesh HaRishon on the first month. The first month meaning the first month of the Jewish calendar, which is Nisan. B'chamisha asar yom, on the 15th day of that month. Mimacharas HaPesach, on the day after the Karban Pesach was brought. Remember, we learned the Karban Pesach was brought on the 14th. On the 14th. It was brought on the 14th in the afternoon. It was eaten the night of the 15th, but it was brought on the 14th. Yatsu b'nei Yisrael b'yad Ramah. They went out with a yad Ramah, with an outstretched arm, right? With an uplifted hand. Le'enei kol Mitzrayim, in the presence of all of the Egyptians. Now, we didn't finish this idea. What does this idea mean? They went out b'yad Ramah le'enei kol Mitzrayim. So let's just think for a moment about the dynamics of what's going on with the Egyptians and the Jews. Okay, Bnei Yisrael are leaving. Why are they leaving? They're leaving because they've asked to leave for a long time, but that's not the real reason why they're leaving. They're leaving because the Egyptians are literally chasing them out of Mitzrayim because they're afraid of what's going to happen next, right? It has been one makkah after another makkah after another makkah, and finally Paro seeks out Moshe and Aaron, the plague of the firstborn. Paro seeks out Moshe and Aaron. Paro says, get out of here. Right, so this idea that Bnei Yisrael leave biyad Ramah, what we'll focus on in a moment is, when did Bnei Yisrael leave Mitzrayim? Right, Makas Bechoros, this plague of the firstborn, took place when? At night. What night?
The night before, the night when they made the Korban Pesach.
The night when they ate the Karban Pesach. They slaughtered the Karban Pesach on the eve of the 15th, right? The 14th in the afternoon. That's when they slaughtered the Korban Pesach. They ate the Korban Pesach that evening, bichabura as a group, right? They ate the Korban Pesach that night. They took the blood of the Korban Pesach and they put it on the doorposts of the house, right? That was the night of the 15th. That was the night of Makas Bechoros. That was the night of the killing of the firstborn, and we're going to learn today. It wasn't just the firstborn, it was actually anybody. It was the oldest one in the house. We're going to talk about that. Sharon.
Logistically, how could they eat it together?
They made this stuff.
Wait, what does that mean? How could they eat it together?
So many hundreds of thousands of people?
No, they didn't eat. It wasn't like the Neveli, right? You know, it wasn't like the Homoak, Zichrona Livracha, right? It wasn't like everybody was together, but families were together. Right? It wasn't like all of Bnei Yisrael were together, but families were together, like a Seder. Basically the role model of the Seder that we have today. Now, obviously, they didn't have such a long Seder, and it wasn't recounting everything that happened at Yitzias Mitzrayim, because Yitzias Mitzrayim had not happened yet. At the first Seder, Yitzias Mitzrayim had not yet happened. They hadn't left Egypt. Where was the first Seder? First Seder was in Egypt. Right? It was in Egypt. They hadn't left yet. But Makas Bechoros. Tina, you had a question?
So, yeah. When you say Makas Bechoros, does that mean the oldest animals too? When you say everything was,
We'll talk about exactly what Makas Bechoros was. It was the firstborn. If there was no firstborn in the house, it was the Gadol Habayis. It was the oldest person in the house. It was within the servants, within the animals. It was a blanket attack against the firstborn.
Okay, so why the blood on the doorpost? Was that to give Bnei Israel a mitzvah to do?
No, there was no mitzvah. It was a mitzvah from the sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded them to do it. But what was the purpose of doing it? The purpose of doing it was to identify the house as a Jewish house. Wait a second, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't know which house is Jewish, which house isn't Jewish, right? So to show the Mitzrim, why show the Mitzrim? Mitzrim knew where the Jews were. The Mitzrim knew where the Jews lived. So one interpretation is that, and we're already back in Chumash Shmos, one interpretation is that it was for the mashchis. What was the mashchis? In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed this mashchis, lahashchit means to destroy, right? The mashchit is the angel of destruction. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu allowed this angel of destruction into the world. And when this angel of destruction comes into the world, it doesn't distinguish. It just destroys. It doesn't distinguish. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you need this sign to distinguish between your home and the Egyptian homes, and the angel of destruction will avoid your home because of this sign. But there are others to say it wasn't a sign for the angel of destruction. It wasn't a sign, obviously, for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was a sign for Bnei Yisrael. It was a sign for Bnei Yisrael that they were not to go outside of the house tonight. Tonight was a night to be within the house. Tonight was a night to be within the home. Not to go out, because it was dangerous. If you went out, it was dangerous. So not to go outside of the house. Okay.
Would that be a precursor of the mezuzah?
So the answer is no. Although the average person, if you ask the average person, they will tell you that we have a mezuzah because we put the blood on the doorpost of the house. The only thing which is similar is the fact that it's the doorpost. Right? That's the only thing. The mitzvah of mezuzah is rooted in the obligation of the Torah that we read in the Shema to write these words on your doorpost. Now, there's a similar idea, right? It's a similar idea. It's supposed to serve as a reminder. The doorpost serves as a reminder. When you go out, when you come in, it's a reminder what you bring with you, what you bring into the house. So from that perspective, there is a similarity. But the mitzvah of mezuzah is separate and distinct from this one-time commandment to smear the blood on the doorpost of the house.
Something you said just before we broke, we were talking about they were painting the blood, and you said they also included the blood of all the men who were circumcised that very day and mixed with this blood of the lamb. It was so bizarre.
Which
They
part?
collected the blood of the circumcisions and mixed it with it was a brand new idea to me. And
Yes, it's actually,
That's what she said.
no,
Does it actually say this?
yeah, so if you look back, let's see. I left my glasses, that's the point, I left my glasses in the office, no. I'll just squint, it's fine. No, it's not a problem. Okay, so let's look back, let's go back in Chumash. We're gonna finish by June, just maybe not June 2025. Okay, let's see here. Okay, we are looking back in Chumash Shmos in Parshas Bo. We are looking for the obligation. Okay, let's see. Where did Hashem say to mix the blood? Okay. So here's what it has. Okay, page 354. Vayikra Moshe l'chol ziknei Yisrael vayomer aleihem mishchu ukechu lachem tzon lemishpotechem v'shachatu hapasach. Right, take a sheep and slaughter it as the korban pesach. Ulakachtem, and take agudas ezov. Agudas ezov is the biblical equivalent of a paintbrush, right? It's a bundle of hyssop, right? It's what they used. They didn't have a paintbrush. It's what they used, right? A bundle of hyssop. Utvaltem badam asher basaf, and dip it in the blood that is in the basin. V'higatam el hamashkof v'el shtei hamizuzos min hadam basaf, and touch the lintel. The lintel is the piece of the door frame that's across the top. V'el shtei hamizuzot, and the two side pieces of the frame. Asher basaf, right? And touch them with the hyssop that has on it blood from the basin. The atem, and you, lo seitzuu ish mi pesach beiso ad boker. No one should leave the house until the morning. Okay. Va'avar Hashem lingof es Mitzrayim. Hashem will pass through Mitzrayim that night to strike them. V'ra'ah es hadam al hamashkof v'al shtei hamizuzos. And Hashem will see the blood which is on the lintel and on the side posts. Ufasach Hashem al Pesach, and Hashem will pass over, hence the name, right? Hashem will pass over the door. V'lo yitein hamashchis lavo al batechem lingof, and he will not allow the mashchis, the destroying angel, the angel of destruction, to enter into the house. Okay. Interesting, it doesn't say anything here about bris milah. It doesn't say anything here about bris milah. Let's see if you.
Mingle blood of circumcision and Pesach.
Where do you read it? Okay, so look at the bottom of page 353. 353.
Number 13.
Okay, so 353, so we're going back. So we're going back even before, right before where I started. Go back to 353. And here, what does the Chumash say? Here we're talking about the mitzvah of Achilas Pesach. How did they eat the korban Pesach? So they had to eat, first it had to be roasted, right? We know the korban Pesach had to be roasted on a spit. It had to be roasted outside of the house, and it had to be roasted in a way so that all of the Egyptians would smell their God being cooked, right, on the spit. That was the intention of it, right? That the barbecue would be smelled by all of the Egyptians, and it had to look like a sheep. In other words, you had to roast it as you couldn't cut it up into pieces and roast it that way. It needed to be roasted whole so that the Egyptians could not mistake it, for anything else. It was indeed the animal that they worshipped. And then, veloso siru mimeno ad boker, you're not allowed to leave anything over until the morning. Va'anosa mimeno ad boker ba'esh tisrof, it has to be burned. V'kacha tochlu oso, and this is how you eat the Karban Pesach. Masnechem chagurim na'alechem beraglechem. You're ready to go. You eat the Karban Pesach ready to go, right? Your loins are girded, whatever that expression means. Your shoes are on your feet. Makalchem biyedchem. Your staff is in your hand. Your backpack is ready. You're ready to go. Va'achaltem oso b'chipazon, and you have to eat it quickly. Pesachu Lashem. This is the way you eat the Karban Pesach, right? Interesting. We often associate chipazon with matzah. In other words, matzah has an element of quickly to it because you don't want it to become chametz. Here we're talking about the way in which the Karban Pesach needed to be eaten. In other words, this wasn't a luxurious meal. It wasn't they could sit back and they could schmooze and they could take their time and they could eat and have 15 courses and everything else. And the waiter brings out, 4 mains and everything. No, it wasn't like that. What was it? Bechipazon. You were ready to go. You were dressed to go. You were ready to go. This was an example of hurry up and do nothing. Because what happened?
Today it's a negative. Today it's a negative.
Today it's a negative. But what happened after the Karban Pesach? What happened after they did this? What happened after they ate? They were all dressed. They were ready to go. The bags were packed. Their staff was in their hand. Shoes were on their feet. They were ready to go. What happened after the Karban Pesach? Gornish. Nothing.
They didn't leave.
They didn't leave. They didn't leave at night. When did they leave? They left the next day. They didn't leave at night. But the whole eating of this Karban Pesach had to be done bechipazon. Bechipazon is an element of the entire Pesach experience. All of this had to be done quickly, not in a state of luxury, because they couldn't show the luxury of hanging out in Egypt, even though they weren't leaving that night. Your question?
When did they leave?
When did they leave?
Midday. Next day.
Midday?
Midday at
12 o'clock.
Samayam.
They left the next day in the middle of the day.
So how come we say that the dogs didn't bark when they were leaving, when Egyptians were sleeping? Where does that come from?
No, we say the dogs didn't bark. The Egyptians weren't sleeping. It was the middle of the day. We're going to learn a little bit this morning, hopefully, about what the Egyptians were doing. But they weren't sleeping. The Egyptians were not sleeping, but the dogs would bark nevertheless. Talking about, 2 million people, leaving a place. It's going to create a ruckus even in the middle of the day. And the dogs should have barked. That would have been the normal thing, but they didn't bark. And it was not because the Egyptians knew they were leaving. It's not like 2 million people or 1.5 million people can sneak out from somewhere. It's not like what happens during a drasha. That can't happen, right? You have 2 million people leaving, 1.5 million people leaving. Everybody's going to know they're leaving. The Egyptians knew they were leaving. The Egyptians wanted them to leave, right? They wanted them to leave. The Egyptians wanted them to leave that night, right? Paro came and said, "Get out of here." They wanted them to leave that night, but the Jews refused to leave that night.
Why?
Because they didn't want to leave with their tail between their legs, so to speak. They didn't want to sneak out in the night like ganavim, right? Like thieves, right? They wanted to go out in broad daylight, holding the flags, right? Everybody had a flag, right? They didn't, but imagine, right? Holding the flags, bands, singing and dancing, and they wanted to leave. That's how they were leaving. They weren't leaving because they were being chased out of Egypt. They were leaving because HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought them out of Egypt. So the 14th, they ate it. No, they cooked it in the afternoon of the 14th. That's when they cooked the Karban Pesach. The night of the 15th, they sat together and they ate the Karban Pesach. They went to sleep, The night of the 15th.
14th night.
The 14th during the day, remember the 14th ends at dark. So the 14th in the afternoon is when they slaughtered the Karban Pesach. And they cooked the Karban Pesach. Then it became dark. Now it's the 15th of Nisan, the night of which would be Pesach, the night of that which would be the night of the Seder. It wasn't a Seder then, but that would be the night of the Seder. What did they do that night? They ate the Karban Pesach. They ate the Karban Pesach with matzah, they ate the Karban Pesach with maror. That's how they ate the Karban Pesach that night. But they did it in a particular way, b'chipazon, and then they went to sleep. And that night, when they went to sleep, that's when the firstborn were killed.
And then the 15th
And then the morning, which is the morning of the 15th, right? Previous night was the night of the 15th. This is now the morning of the 15th. Now they're getting ready. Midday of the 15th, they leave Egypt. They leave
Why
Egypt.
do they have to be all dressed if they were going to go to sleep afterwards?
The idea was to show that this was not a meal of luxury, right? So here I'll give you an example. Okay, I'll give you an example. I have to be careful how I word this. So so the bungalow colony experience has that Friday night. There's a particular kind of clothing that women wear. I don't know what it's called. I would call it a robe, but it's pasnished. Can't call it a robe. It has a name to it. But it has a name to it. Whatever it is, I don't know. It has a name. It has a particular name to it. It's like instead of wearing pajamas, what do you wear? You wear this it's like a Shabbos robe. It's like a nice robe. But you don't get dressed, right? So imagine you're sitting, it's luxury, you're in your pajamas, you're in your robe. That's not what that night was supposed to be. Even though they weren't leaving that night, they didn't want to be sitting. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, you're not going to sit and eat this as a meal of luxury, right? Because this is all part of the process of leaving Egypt. Yes, they went to sleep. They got undressed. They went to sleep. They got up the next morning. They got dressed again, and they left. Okay, but they left in the middle of the day, right? They left in the middle of the day. So why did they have to be dressed with their staff in their hand and their backpack on and their shoes and their loins girded, ready to go? To show that this was not a meal that they would eat luxuriously. They would eat slowly, right? They would eat it b'chipazon because this was the beginning of the process of redemption. Sharon, go ahead.
In Pasuk Yud Gimel in Rashi, he refers to the dam.
Yeah, we didn't get there yet. Let's go. Chedva, hang on just a second. We'll get there because Chedva brought this up originally.
353.
Right. So we're
They see it.
right. So let's continue back on 352. So let's continue back on 352. What is pasuk? Pasuk Yud Gimel now. Okay. What do we say? Okay, Kadosh Baruch Hu was passing through. He's killing everyone, right? V'haya hadam lachem laos al habatim. The blood will be for you a sign upon the doors. Asher atem sham v'ra'isi as adam fasachti alechem v'lo yevachem negef lemashchis ba'kosi be'eretz Mitzrayim. Okay, that this is the dam that is there. Now, Thelma directed us to commentary 13, right? On page 353, Hadam, the mingled blood of circumcision and the Pesach offering. The mingled blood of circumcision and the Pesach offering. This is the Mechilta, right? The Medrash brings this. Sharon is pointing out Rashi on our pasuk on 354. What Rashi are you referring to?
Yud Gimel.
Rashi pasuk Yud Gimel, where he talks about Vahaya Hadam. What does Rashi say? Why did they make this print so small? Vahaya Hadam laos, lachem laos, v'lo la'acherim laos. This is what we said. This will be a sign for you and not for others. Vorisi es Adam. I can't read it. Okay. Who can read that Rashi there?
Look at the other one, too.
That's what happened.
Kol galoi lefanav.
Right. Okay, but Rashi talks about the mixture. Sharon, you're saying Rashi talks about the mixture. I just don't
Look
have.
at the English. See
The English is the Mechilta, right? Rashi's
Right,
quoting.
Rashi quotes.
Rashi's quoting the Mechilta. Okay, Rashi's quoting. I just can't read it because of my glasses. Rashi's quoting the Mechilta. So the blood of the bris milah and the blood of the Karban Pesach were intermingled together. If you go to a bris, so they say at a bris, the expression "Va'omer lach b'damayich chayi, va'omer lach b'damayich chayi." You probably have heard this at a bris, right? No. Va'omer lach b'damayich chayi, va'omer lach b'damayich chayi. Right? Why does it mention the pasuk twice? One, it refers to the blood of the Karban Pesach, and one refers to the blood of the bris milah. Now, Chedva is correct. It's a little bit gross, right? If you think about this, right, they're collecting the blood of the bris milah, right? There's not a lot of blood from a bris milah. If a bris milah is done properly, there is not a lot of blood from the bris milah. In fact, part of the mitzvah of bris milah is to excise a little bit of dam from the place where the bris milah takes place, from the place where the cut was, right? That's part of this. And here's a whole controversy, right? Here's a whole controversy about the mitzvah of mitzitza, right?
Yeah.
There is a mitzvah of mitzitza. By the way, how do you say pacifier in Hebrew?
Moses.
A motzes, right? A motzes is a pacifier in Hebrew because something on which you suck. Mitzitza is the mitzvah of suctioning out some blood from the place where the bris milah takes place, right? Now, so it's not like there is a lot. There is some bleeding, obviously, because you're cutting skin. So there's clearly going to be some bleeding, and the mohel bandages it, and there's special powder that the mohel puts on it.
You're talking about an 8-year-old baby.
I'm talking about an 8-year-old baby.
We're talking about all the adult.
Correct. One would assume that there was a little bit more bleeding, right? That there was a little bit more bleeding from all of these men, right? We're talking about 600,000 men between the age of 20 or 18 and 60, or 20 and 60, but also the children who were younger. Everybody had a bris milah. All of the men had a bris milah. No, they didn't do bris milah in Mitzrayim. The language, clothes, and names. They didn't change their names.
They did not do wow.
I don't see this in Rashi. There's a mechilta quoted in Rashi, but it's not the same mechilta because next to the word mechilta
Why
it
is
says
that
Yeshayahu,
possible?
and in the English it says Yehezkel.
Because mentions it.
In the Rashi, it says Yeshayahu and then mechilta.
Even
Is there
the
another
Levi,
mechilta here?
the Bnei Levi, like Moshe's family, Aaron, they didn't.
Moshe was born
Yeah.
Mahul.
Okay.
Right? Moshe was born with a bris milah.
What's the word again?
Mahul.
What?
Mahul. Mem, He, Vav, Lamed. Moshe was born Mahul. But obviously the others were not, and there was not, and they did not do bris milah.
How could
They-
they go on a trip the next day after?
So this is a great, right? Right. So this is a great question, right? How could, first of all, I thought you were going to ask. I thought you were going to ask another question because there's always a difference in teaching men and women, right? I think I've mentioned this to you before. When you teach men, they basically ignore the practicalities of life, which is like a man thing to do. They basically ignore the practicalities of life. When you teach women, they focus on the practicalities of life. So I thought you were going to ask me, who did all these bris milahs, right? In other words, right there, right. Right. Obviously, it was, was there one mohel? That's not feasible. Did they do it? Did they do it on themselves? That's a little bit challenging as well. How did all of this happen? We don't know. So the answer is we don't know. Right? We don't know. We don't know. Maybe the women did it. Maybe the women did it for the men. We don't know. Right? one,
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, I can't accept Sipor as she said did to Moshe's kids.
Tzipora did, correct.
That's before
Yeah.
we had Yetziat Mitzrayim. How come, not,
Because
Sipporah-
Moshe was not living in Mitzrayim. Remember, Moshe was not living in Mitzrayim.
But how could Sipporah know about this mitzvah and the Jews that live in Mitzrayim didn't know it?
No, they knew about the mitzvah. The Jews who lived in Mitzrayim knew about the mitzvah, right? But what happened? But they stopped observing it. They stopped observing Bris Milah. When the Jews first came down to Mitzrayim, we never learned Chumash Shmos, so I guess that's the next one. Right? When they first came down from Canaan to Mitzrayim, Yosef had all of the Egyptians circumcise themselves. Why? So that the Jews, so they wouldn't make fun of the Jews who were circumcised. So the entire male population of Egyptians circumcised themselves on Yosef's command, right, to do this. Not the first time that a people has circumcised themselves on the command of the king. So think back to Dinah and Shechem and Hamor and what happened there, right? Okay. So all of it, but that was when they first came down. We're talking 210 years later. We're right. 210 years, it's a lot of time, right? 210 years later, right? Multiple generations later, generations that were oppressed with slavery, they didn't do Bris Milah.
Where does it say this?
Where does it say that they
Where does it
didn't
say
do
that
Bris Milah?
No man did circumcise?
No. Hold on, let's,
I just thought it was during the midbar.
no, so we know that in the,
Yeshua did
no, so I mentioned, I think last time, before the summer, we know that in the midbar they didn't do Bris Milah. Right? They didn't do Bris Milah in the midbar because they were traveling, and they didn't bring the Karban Pesach in the midbar other than that first time. The first year they brought the Karban Pesach, but after that they didn't.
If they were also traveling on that night, if you're saying that.
Yes, I'm just looking to see.
You have to go to the filter.
Where was the commandment of Bris
You're on
Milah?
topic, I start writing in the margins, now everything's in the margins.
Is the commandment of Bris Milah? Let's see.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have opened.
No, that's all right. I just,
Out. Were we staying so far away from what you knew?
But you also didn't like the korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash.
Yes, I do. But that's a personal thing, but yeah, I mean.
And you didn't do this, just.
No, but we
Okay,
learned
hold on a
about
second,
it.
hold on a
We
second.
circumcised themselves as they were leaving. Everyone talks about the matzah, no one talks about circumcision.
Yeah,
This is the first I hear of this.
yeah.
This is-
Even Rabbi Gershon is the one that's not Jew.
You have good memory.
no, we are told, just looking to see where it is, that an Arel is not allowed to eat from the Karban Pesach. An Arel is an uncircumcised male.
So weren't they all Arians?
So that's why they had to be circumcised.
But in the desert, they didn't do it.
Right, they didn't do the carbon.
That's later.
No, then why did they not have a breast, I mean, for 40 years? And then when did they do it? Before they
Then
came
they didn't do it
into
because
Ugh.
they were traveling.
What?
Okay.
They were in transit
So they
in the
didn't,
desert, so they didn't do it. That makes sense to me. But for 210 years, they didn't do it, even though.
and they did, but they
Yeah,
had
they
it
did
before,
it
I think they had it before they entered the land.
What about when they entered the land and they were short, did then?
Yes.
Then they were also.
He was sure he did.
They were sure to what?
You know, for an old
So these
citizen,
were one of the ones that needed.
Rabbi Yosai, you could ignore the question.
so you're saying that it went by the wayside for.
Perek Yud Beis Pasuk Memches. Perek Yud Beis Pasuk Mem Ches.
Yes, what is it?
360.
360.
Yes, gosh. What does the pasuk say? We're talking here about the additional laws of the Karban Pesach. Start with pasuk Mem Gimel. Vayomer Hashem al Moshe v'Aaron zos chukas Pasach kol ben nechar lo yochal bo. So if you're not Jewish, you can't eat from the Karban Pesach. That's not the reason, by the way, why you can't have non-Jews at your Seder. You can't have non-Jews at your Seder for a different reason. This is not the reason. We don't have a Karban Pesach anymore, so this is now no longer applies. B'chol eved ish miknas kesef umalta oso az yochal bo. And any eved, right, a servant who was considered a possession, servants had bris milah, then they could eat. Okay, toshav v'sachir lo yochal bo. They non-citizens couldn't eat. Then more here, memches. All right, at the end of pasuk. So pasuk memches. V'chiyagorit chager. Right, when a stranger dwells with you, v'yasah pesach lashem, himol lo kol zachar. Right, he has to have a bris milah. V'az yikrav la'asoso v'haya be'ezrach ha'aretz v'chol v'haya ki ezrach ha'aretz v'chol arel lo yochal bo. Everyone who is not circumcised is not allowed to eat from the Karban Pesach. Okay? Doesn't mention it. Okay. Okay. So you had to be circumcised in order to eat from the Karban Pesach. Bnei Yisrael had not been circumcised, so they circumcised. The men were circumcised, and then they were able to eat from this Karban Pesach. But what you're asking me is, where in the Torah does it say that? Where in the Torah does it say that they circumcised themselves?
They're talking about the, like, Ebed Mali needing a circumcision or whatever, that's a different story.
It says all the children of Israel did as
That's a
Hashem
better
had commanded
explanation.
them. So did they do. So did they do.
Thank you for letting me
Is there such a big
It was the
emphasis on the 3 days of
Okay.
recuperation?
We'll leave this, right?
There's such a big
Emphasis on the 3 days of recuperate. I mean, so that goes back to Sharon's question, which was, wait a second, how can you travel? You know, they did bris milah, right? You could only do bris milah during the day. They did bris milah on the day of, same day they brought the Karban Pesach. They ate that night, and now they're traveling the next day. How could they do that? And how could they do that? So that was, Sharon said it was a miracle. I will come back to you next week and show you all of these sources for this. Okay, let's jump back to our part. But Chedva, that's the idea, right? The idea, which I haven't yet fully shown you. My apologies. The idea is that there were among the Jews men, all of the men, with the exception of Moshe and his children,
What about Levi?
who had not done bris milah, including Levi, who had not done bris milah. It was not done. And they all needed to circumcise themselves before eating the Karban Pesach. The blood from that circumcision and the blood from the Karban Pesach was mixed together and put on the doorposts. These two mitzvos were the merit that enabled Bnei Yisrael to leave Mitzrayim. The mitzvah, the merit of Milah and the merit of Karban Pesach enabled Bnei Yisrael to leave Mitzrayim. That is these two mitzvos mixed together. Last question, and then we're moving
It
on.
says all the children of Israel did as Hashem had commanded Moshe and Aaron. It's like Aaron was Brit Milah.
And what?
Aaron was Brit Milah because they did what Moshe and Aaron said. All the children of Israel did as Hashem had commanded.
Aharon might have had a bris milah because he was back from the time when they first came in. But they hadn't done a bris milah on all of the people since then. I'll come back to you with more specifics next week, and I'll bring my glasses. What?
Zipporah knew about it. She was
No, correct. Zipporah knew about it. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. Okay, let's come back to our pasuk. Okay, 918. 918. Another rabbit hole. Baruch Hashem. We began the year with a rabbit hole. Baruch Hashem. All right. So this idea. So now Bnei Yisrael eat the Karban Pesach on the 15th. I mentioned to you last time. Just I'm chazering now. Everything was firstborn oriented. Let's think about this, okay? They ate the Karban Pesach on the 15th. What was the 15th of the month? The 15th of the month is a full moon. It is a full moon, right? What was the animal that the Egyptians worshipped? It was the animal of the sheep, right? It was the sheep that the Egyptians worshipped. The constellation that corresponds to the sheep is, anybody know the zodiac constellation that corresponds to sheep? Aries, the ram, right? A constellation is a grouping of stars that throughout history have been put together in some kind of mythical image, right? So there were a grouping of stars that formed the constellation of Aries, right? Aries, which in Hebrew is the constellation of the Tleh. Tes Lamed He. The constellation of the Tleh. What is the Tleh? Tleh is the sheep, right? This is the ram. A ram is a male sheep, right? So the idea, the sheep, this sign, the Aries, is considered the first sign of the zodiac. It's the Bechor. Who was the strongest in the family? It was the Bechor. What happened? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, Dafko on the 15th of the month, at the time when the moon is strongest. Remember, we spoke about the minhag of Hasidim, time when the moon is at its highest peak, so to speak, at its greatest light. That's when I'm going to take you out of Egypt, right? In the midst of the strength of the Egyptians, right? We're going to slaughter their gods. We're going to kill their firstborn, right? And you, my firstborn, I'm bringing out of Egypt. It was a sign of strength, right? The Yitzias Mitzrayim was a sign of strength, and Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim not as thieves in the night, but in the middle of the day. Okay. The pasuk that I intended to do with you today was pasuk Daled. What does pasuk Daled say? Umitzrayim mekabrim eis asher hikah Hashem bahem. What were the Egyptians doing on the day of the 15th? They were busy burying their firstborn children. Right? Imagine the sense, right? Avelis. The entire land, the entire country of Egypt was filled with levayas, with funerals. And all of the Egyptians were burying their firstborn children who had been killed. And the commentaries point out that if there wasn't a firstborn at home, then the oldest of the house, the oldest child of the house, was killed. Ein bayis asher ein shames. There was no home, no Egyptian home that did not experience some death. There was death in every Egyptian home. So the following day, what happened? They were in the midst of burying all of their children, right? So when the Egyptians were so frum, they had to bury their children the next day. Right here you have to negotiate with families to get a burial the same day. Or the Egyptians were so frum that they were all burying their children the next day. No. Why did people bury the next day? Because it's the Middle East. In the Middle East, it is hot. And what happens to a body if you don't bury it? It starts to decompose. It smells. It starts to decompose. We, Baruch Hashem, we live in a society where Person dies, what do? You put them in the refrigerator. You put them in the refrigerator, they can stay in the refrigerator for days. For days. Right? You put them in the refrigerator. You couldn't do that then. Right? What happened? You buried them the next day. This is what Yaakov Avinu says about burying Rachel. Where did he bury Rachel? In Beis Lechem. Why did he bury her in Beis Lechem? Because to take the time to travel to Hebron, even though Hebron is not so far from Beis Lechem, with the body would start to decompose, not considered kavod hames. Right? So basically, in those days, people were where they died. That's where they were buried. Wasn't like there were cemeteries and okay, the Levaya will be such and such a day. No, that didn't happen. Person died on the road traveling. They buried them on the road. That's why Kohanim had to be so careful, because there weren't cemeteries. People were buried all over the place. So people are buried all over the place. There's tumah all over the place. So that's why Kohanim had to be particularly careful in those days. So what were the Egyptians doing? Right? They were busy burying their dead. And that, Rashi points out, is why Bnei Yisrael were able to leave Biyad Ramah. Right? How did Bnei Yisrael leave? They left. As, they didn't sneak out. They left with a certain presence. Right? They walked out of Mitzrayim, Biyad Ramah. The Pasuk Gimel, the end of Pasuk Gimel says, Biyad Ramah le'enei kol Mitzrayim. Right? They left with an uplifted hand. Right? I almost think of them going out like this. Right? They left with an uplifted hand in the face of the Egyptians, meaning in the presence, right against it. Right in the face of the Egyptians, they left. What were the Egyptians doing? The Egyptians were burying their dead. So there was, imagine this scenario of leave. This is how Bnei Yisrael started. It was an absolute demonstration of the power of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. An absolute demonstration, right? The Egyptians were busy burying their dead. They didn't lift a finger against the Jews. And the Jews left, Biyad Ramah, in the middle of the day. That's how they went out. Torah tells us, Asher hikah Hashem bahem kol bechor. Kadosh Baruch Hu had smitten every bechor. Uvelo heihem asa Hashem shvatim. And what happened? And against their gods, Hashem had done signs and wonders. Now, we say against their gods, Hashem had done signs and wonders. What are we talking about? Who did the Egyptians worship? The Egyptians worshiped the sheep. How was the sheep coming to help them at this point? It wasn't. Not only was the sheep not coming to help them, right? Not only the God they worshipped was not coming to help them, but the Jews had total control over their gods. The Jews were consuming the gods that the Egyptians worshipped, right? So this is the scenario, right? This is the scenario of how Bnei Yisrael left this oppression in Egypt. They left with their heads held high in the middle of the day, the Egyptians burying their dead. Nobody lifted up a finger to stop them, right? And they marched out of Egypt. Okay.
The Egyptians had more than one god, right? They had sheep, they had idols, they had
the sun god.
the Nile, a lot of
Right.
gods, right?
The Egyptians had a lot of gods, and throughout the Makos, what they worshipped were attacked. As if to say, Kadosh Baruch Hu was sending the message: your gods are powerless. Right?
Right. Like the dam in the Nile.
The dam in the Nile, right? Your God,
Shech instead of the sun.
right? The Choshech covering up, right? Covering up the sun. The Egyptians worshipped the sun. 3 days there was no sun, right? All of these things were Kadosh Baruch Hu not only sending the message that the Jews are leaving, but also that your gods are worthless.
So isn't it really strange that like 2 days later they decided to run after, to pursue Bnei Israel?
I mean, we're not going to go there because this is really Chumash Shmos. It wasn't 2 days later. It was 3 days later. It was a 3-day journey, right? But is it a little bit strange?
Yeah.
I don't know that it's a little bit strange. right? Think about Mariv. Here, you know what? I'll tell you why it's not a little bit strange. Think about Mariv following Ne'ilah. Just think about Mariv following Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur.
Okay, got it.
Right, on Yom Kippur. You just spent the holiest day of the year. Everybody was davening, everybody was klapping al cheid, everybody was crying, everybody was making all of these resolutions. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. Shofar, boom, out the door. Think about it. It's not just our shul. It happens in many shuls. One year, many years ago, I don't know if any of you remember this, one year, many years ago, I think it was my second year here, I did what they do at KJ. I put the shofar blowing after Mariv.
They do that in the Young Israel movement.
I put the shofar blowing after Mariv. Literally, I almost got lynched. Like seriously. Right? Seriously, people were like beside themselves. Right? Beside themselves. But if you ask, how can people change so quickly? Think about Mariv following Ne'ilah. Right? What happens? People running out, they're eating, they're not making brachos. It's human nature. Right? So yeah, the Egyptians, right, when the Jews were there and they were suffering, now 3 days later, the Jews aren't there anymore and they're saying to themselves, hey, what did we do? Or maybe Paro is saying, hey, what did I do? And now I'm commanding everybody to go get them.
Also
Right.
look at the LL check-in on let's say Yom Kippur, where everybody's just finished Ne'ilah and they're behaving like animals on the check-in line.
Is that only Motzei Yom Kippur?
No, but it's, they just finished out.
Right, you would think,
there
right?
was some civility.
You would think, right? You would think. I mean, like it's Chodesh Elul. Right, it's Chodesh Elul. Right, it's Chodesh Elul. Right, we need to start to get ready. Chodesh Elul, we should be thinking about, becoming better people and doing this and, doing everything that we should be doing. Okay. Okay. Hi. All right. So where were Bnei Yisrael? All we're told in Pasuk Dalid is that they leave, right? They leave. Pasuk Gimel tells us where they left from, which is where? Vayisu'u me Ramses. What was Ramses?
One of the cities that they
Oh, okay. So very interesting, right? The first thing that we think about is that when Bnei Yisrael were part of the original Shibud, the original enslavement of Bnei Yisrael, is that they were building Pitom and Ramses, right? And what happened? They were building Pitom and Ramses, right? They were building these cities, and what was special about these cities? As they built the cities, what happened? They sunk into the ground. That's not this Ramses. There were two places. There was a Ramses and a Ramses. Right? This is Ramses. This was a place in Egypt that all of Bnei Yisrael came to. In other words, where were Bnei Yisrael? Right? This was the what do you call that? The staging ground for them to leave. It wasn't like they all left from their various places wherever they were. They all came to Ramses and they all left from Ramses. And where did they go? So the next pasuk, and we'll start with this again next week. Vayis'u b'nei Yisrael mi Ramses. Now notice it doesn't say Ramses. Mi Ramses vayachanu b'Sukkos. They went from Ramses to Sukkos. We'll look at the map next week. We'll see where that is in Mitzrayim. We have a couple of weeks still to learn before Rosh Hashanah. I hope you'll come back. Thelma, go ahead.
He told me Ramses where the Jews were building the cities on quicksand.
Correct. Sharon.
Is it possible that the Jews did not have Brit Milah because it was forbidden by the Egyptians? Not that they abandoned it. That was imposed upon them.
I'm not sure. Possible, but I don't think so. All right, we'll all look at this. We'll see you all next week in Yirtzeh Hashem. Have a great week, everybody. Ellen has an announcement.